This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
Formal association with God's people has always been the norm. That continues in the New Covenant as much as the Old. So that's where I want to start, just this biblical covenantal principle that we see from the earliest days with Israel under Moses, even up to the New Testament epistles.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. My name is Jonathan Master. I'm joined by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm well. Looking forward to our discussion about church membership.
Yes, very important discussion and a very timely and helpful little book. It's entitled Church Membership. It's in the Blessings of the Faith series that's published by P&R, and the general editor of that is Jason Halopoulos. But the author of this book on church membership is Jonathan Landry Cruse, who pastors Community Presbyterian Church, an OPC congregation in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Jonathan, thank you for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be with you both.
Well, I wanted to just begin by asking this question. Church membership is something that many people take for granted, but it's been, but there are a lot of congregations out there that either are directly opposed to church membership or just don't value it at all. So what are some of the common arguments against church membership? You're making a positive case for it, but I'm imagining some of our listeners have a kind of negative view of the idea of church membership. So what are the negatives? And then we'll get to your positive case for it.
Sure. The most important argument to take head on would be the argument that says church membership is unbiblical. And of course, if somebody is convinced of that position, I suppose we could be glad that they don't practice it. However, we would want to assert that, in fact, it is a biblical position. We can talk about that in a little bit. But that's certainly a big argument against it. People don't see chapter and verse that says thou shalt join a church. So we have that. Another one, perhaps less theological and more practical, maybe even more just personal, is I've been hurt by church leaders, and I don't want to submit to anyone except for Christ. Maybe people have even tried that before, or they've seen it done poorly with family or friends. They've seen how elders and pastors can abuse their positions of authority. And so people might be open to the idea of attending church and even attending it faithfully, but no, we're not going to take a step of membership, which would mean I have to kind of submit in some fashion to fallen men who are prone to abuse power. I would say those are two primary arguments against it.
So let's start with those, because I think that this will help be a jumping off point for the positive case you make. Is church membership biblical? The obvious answer, of course, you're going to give it, and we would give it yes, but unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so we need to be thoughtful here because indeed there is not a chapter and verse that states as much. But what we find in the New Testament and how the church operates is that there's an assumption that there is a formal association between leaders and laity. So that comes out just in the New Testament epistles in terms of how people like Paul and Peter will write to instruct and encourage the church. Peter will say things like to elders, shepherd the flock that is among you. He doesn't just say shepherd any flock, but there's a delineated group. There's a specific number of people that Peter's saying you're in charge of. Well, how do we know that? There must be some formal association. Likewise, in Hebrews, submit to your leaders and obey your leaders. Not any leaders, but your leaders. Somehow there's a clear distinction between people outside of the church and people inside the church. People who have a responsibility to particular pastors, elders, and those who don't have that responsibility because they're not part of the church, so that command doesn't fall to them. But the really interesting thing to note is that this doesn't just start in the New Testament. This is something that's true in the Old Testament, that God's people were always known by him, known to each other, and known in the world. People knew who belonged to God. There were physical signs like circumcision. There were markers that identified one as belonging to Israel and not. You couldn't just sort of sit in the back pews, so to speak, get your spiritual fix and then leave and have nothing to do with the people of God or with the leaders in God's people. So there's always been a formal and public association in the people of God, and that just carries into the New Testament, which would be my argument as to why the New Testament authors never felt they needed to say explicitly, you need to join a church. It would just have been understood. Formal association with God's people has always been the norm. That continues in the New Covenant as much as the Old. So that's where I would want to start, just this biblical covenantal principle that we see from the earliest days with Israel under Moses, even up to the New Testament epistles.
Jonathan, do you think I'm sorry, I butted in on Jonathan.
No, go, James, go ahead.
Good question. Do you think, what do you make of verses, like I was thinking of Colossians 4, which says that Epaphras, who is one of your number, sends greetings. So Epaphras is away from his home church, but that's how Paul describes him, as one of your number. Would that be at least obliquely a reference that there's a role, at least, or something like that?
Yeah, there has to be. That's a great example. A lot of the verses that end up at the end of our New Testament epistles, I would appeal to. So Romans 16, we have this long list of people that Paul wants folks to greet. Greet Mary, who's worked hard for you. Greet Urbanus, a fellow worker in Christ, and he lists all these people. Well, how does he know they're there? Right. And likewise, Epaphras is mentioned in Colossians and Philemon and things like this. So there's this idea that even as Paul's writing, he's not just writing to cities, to areas. He's writing to people, and he knows who's in and who's out, or at least he has some sense. I mean, he planted a lot of these churches. So yeah, that would be another, I think, hint, a New Testament hint that something like formal membership is taking place. You asked about a role. What about in Acts when we're given numbers of people that are added to the church? Well, who knew that 4,000 were added that day, right?
Yeah, good question. If there's no numbering of the members, then how can you say how much has been added or not?
Right. So, and we don't know exactly what it looked like, but we know something must have happened for people to say, this many people were here and heard the preaching. This many left. This many came forward, were baptized, and were added to the church in Jerusalem, for example. So, yeah, I think that's the reference you mentioned. Colossians is a perfect example.
Yeah, it does strike me that all the instructions given to church leaders in terms of how they're to lead and how they're to even passages that deal with discipline presuppose that there is a defined number, there is a defined group there that's subject to these things and that's under that kind of care and oversight. So you kind of can't imagine. I've always thought you kind of can't imagine the New Testament instructions to the church apart from some kind of membership.
Right. It doesn't. It just falls. The ecclesiology that we find in the New Testament falls apart if membership isn't there. And so, yes, the principle for how the church should function that comes out in these instructions presupposes exactly as you said. Or like you think of Philippians 4. And I mentioned this in the book. Paul says, "I entreat Euodia and Syntyche to agree in the Lord." Well, there's a lot of one anothering in the New Testament epistles, love one another and be kind to one another. But then he writes to Philippi and he's like, there are two in your number that actually the rubber meets the road with them and they have to do it. There's an obligation because these two belong to the Philippian church that they must agree with one another. That wouldn't be true if there wasn't some formal public obligation that numbered those women in that church. Otherwise, Paul couldn't say what he says there in chapter 4.
So let's move on to the fact that this is a good thing. It's a biblical thing, which inherently means it's a good thing. But the whole premise of the series "Blessings of the Faith" is that church membership is not merely something that we must do because the Bible commands it and presupposes it. But no, this is a wonderful blessing that the Lord has given to His people. So, and that addresses your second objection, right? That's the common objection, which is, hey, aren't there all kinds of cases where this gets misused or people get hurt by the church or there's bad leaders and all that kind of stuff? So what about that? That this is a blessing. This is a good thing. This is something that is made for a Christian's benefit.
Yeah. I think, one of the good things to say at first into that objection is that sometimes that does happen. Sometimes people abuse authority and you can be hurt. And even so, that does not excuse one from removing themselves from church membership. I like to remind people who struggle with that the person who is hurt the most by the church is the one who loves her the best, and that's Jesus Christ. And even knowing the failures of his followers and future leaders in the church, he still says to his disciples, says to his believers, says to Christians, the church is the place to be. So we need to at least start there. Recognize, yes, bad things can happen in the church, and yet God never gives that as an excuse to leave the church. In fact, he says it's one of these weird things, right? The only place to be properly healed from the hurts of the church is within the church, because that's where God shows up with the means of grace, and which would be another way to start answering this question: how can leadership be a blessing to me? Well, when done properly, when guided by God's Spirit and according to His Word, we believe that the Lord bestows grace to His people through the preaching of the Word, which is that's a means of discipleship, right? Sitting under the preached Word, you're submitting to God's authority in that way, and through the care and the shepherding of ruling elders, leaders of a local congregation who have committed themselves to the Lord and to that particular church to pray for people, to go through difficult times with them, to warn them of sin when they see it creeping up in their lives. Our lives would be a total wreck, a train wreck, if we did not have those outside voices and even authority speaking into our lives and giving us direction. We can be so we can be so blinded by sin, so ignorant, and so the Lord knows that about us. And in His grace and in His kindness, He places other people who have a burden, an obligation, a responsibility to care for us. He places them in our lives, in the local church, to protect us from sin and to grow us in holiness.
But what if someone were to say to you, and I'm sure people have said this to you, you're a pastor, we've all heard this from one time or another, but what if someone said to you, yeah, but I'll come, I'll sit under your preaching, I'll be discipled by you in that way, and why can't you still pray for me and care for me and shepherd me and pastor me without me taking this step of becoming a member of this particular congregation?
Yeah. So you want me to marry you, but you don't want to marry me is kind of the idea. You want me to take all the obligations of some formal relationship, but you don't want to have any. That's essentially what they're asking. And certainly, I think pastorally, we would want to say to people who are visiting, people who are attending, people who are considering membership, like, we will do these things. We're going to invite you in, bring you in. We will pray for you. But when hard times come, when trouble comes, when sin rears its ugly head, if there's nothing sort of anchoring someone to the local church in the authority of pastors and elders, they're going to hightail it out of there. And so it's actually for their own good that they commit to the church through, usually through vows or some sort of formal public way. They say, we belong here and we're willing to submit to your correction. So one of the vows in the OPC, right, it's the fifth membership vow, is that they'll submit in the Lord to the leadership of the church, even in case they are found delinquent in doctrine or in life. And I remind people as they're taking membership classes, you're volunteering for us to kind of stick our nose in your life, so to speak. And you're telling us up front, straight out of the gate, that if something were to happen wherein you start sinning or you start believing in erroneous doctrine, you're allowing us to tell you you're wrong. People need to go into the church eyes wide open, but that's a blessing. That's a good thing. And so to say, I can come every week, I can be discipled through preaching, and you can pray for me and all that, will there be some blessing there? I'm sure there'll be some blessing, but when you might need it most, will you be willing to receive that reproof and that correction? That would be one of the ways I'd answer that question. There are sure other ways we could as well.
Jonathan, you've sketched some of the benefits of church membership, people watching over your soul, praying for you, feeding you, leading you. And then you also mentioned vows that are taken, which says not only will I receive this from you, but the vows also say, and this is what I'm going to bring.
Yeah. Right.
And in your final chapter in the body of the book, and you have a wonderful section after this of questions and answers that are very specific. But in the final major section of the body of the book, you deal with the responsibilities of church members.
Yeah.
What are some of the basic responsibilities, maybe ordinary as opposed to extraordinary, that we should week in and week out be thinking about?
The first one would be to show up. When you commit to the church, the first thing you're committing to, I mean specifically on Sundays, by the way, is you're committing to the worship of God, to enter his courts with praise and thanksgiving. And so regular attendance and Lord's Day worship, morning and hopefully evening, if your church offers that as well, is something that members are committing to. Because as pastors, we recognize this is the primary means of growth and grace for you. It's what takes place in the assembly. This is where you're admonishing others and being admonished through singing. That's where you're being built up in the faith through the preaching of the word, through the administration of the sacraments, and through prayer. So we commit to showing up on Sundays. That'd be the first thing. Secondly, would be something we've already discussed, which would be submitting to leadership. So, of course, leadership is not infallible, but as a member of a church, you're saying I'm committing to being open to the instruction and correction that elders have. I'm not going to, I'm not going to. I'll still be discerning about it, but my first instinct won't be to say you're wrong and you don't have the right to say that. The first instinct will be let me think on that. Let me prayerfully consider what you're saying and realign my life if I need to. So you want to submit, and then the third thing would be serving. There are a number of passages in the New Testament which would tell us that the church is not there for you to primarily. It's not only there for you to get something from, but it's also there for you to give something to. And the Lord has given you by His Spirit particular gifts, graces, talents, and he's given those to you so that you can build up the body. 1 Corinthians 14, right? It's all about edifying the church, building up the church. That entire chapter about gifts is how they're used in the church. So if you have the Holy Spirit, you do have gifts. If you then therefore are not part of the church, you can't be using your gifts the way that God wants you to. So you are committing. That will look different for other people, for one person to the next, but you are committing to serve the church in some fashion.
Jonathan, we're nearly out of time, but I did want to ask, as you've taught this in the context of your own local congregation, have you found that most of the time, over time, the people who hear this, even if they maybe had a bad church experience or they're initially skeptical of whether this is biblical, I mean, do you continue to get pushback on this, and what shape does that take? And I'm kind of wondering how you handle that pastorally, because I do know that there are certain cases. I remember when I was in pastoral ministry where you would say to someone, I get why this is a really hard thing for you to grab your arms around, and I want to be really patient with you in that. So how do you navigate that? The real pushback that sometimes comes, even among very otherwise committed Christian folks.
Yeah. Pushback continues to come in terms of we continue to get new people, and then it's a kind of, you're doing it all over again, a new concept. But for those who have had initial kind of red flags about it, but said, we recognize this is what you're teaching, and even though maybe it's difficult for us, we're going to submit to that. We've only seen stories of God's grace. One of those people is even a ruling elder in our church now, which is a beautiful thing. Someone who at one point didn't believe in membership now has been charged to care for the souls of our members. But one of the things that is helpful in terms of sort of showing people the seriousness of it, but also the sweetness of it, is built into our ecclesiology, and that is to say that the sacraments are for church members and only church members. So, of course, we would have a difference of opinion depending on who's listening and who's hosting about who should be baptized. But we all believe when you're baptized, that's when you enter the church. So it's for church members. And then same thing with the Lord's Supper, that you can't come until you're baptized, until you're a member of a church. And so there have been people who've been sort of on the fringes in our congregation, have been attending for a long time, unwilling to make that step. And the greatest inducement to them has been their inability to partake of the Lord's Supper because they're not a member of a local church. And so on more than one occasion, we've had people who've come maybe after a year or even longer, and it will be like, okay, what finally, brought you to the point where you're willing? And they said, it's we want to partake of the Lord's Supper. We believe that is for us because we're Christians, and yet you take it seriously, so serious, and we appreciate that. First, maybe they're kind of, oh, this is frustrating that you're not willing to let us come, but they appreciate that we take it seriously, and then they say, and because it's such a serious thing and it's such a blessing, we want to join the church so we can receive it. And so I think that demonstrates a twofold thing about church membership. It's serious, but it's also sweet. When you come, you receive the Lord's means of grace. And so that's been a helpful tool that's just kind of baked into our ecclesiology already.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for your work on this book. It's as with all the things you write, it's clear, it's well organized, and very accessible. So, thank you for that. The book is Church Membership. It's in the Blessings of the Faith series. Jonathan Landry Cruse, thanks for being with us.
You guys you're so kind. Thank you very much for having me,
James. This subject of church membership is interesting because throughout most of the history of the church, it would have been assumed, it would have been taken for granted that it was important for you to be formally associated on the rolls, so to speak, at a church, and that meant different things at different times, and there were all kinds of challenges along the way, but it just would have been assumed. But we are in an interesting 50-year period, maybe getting close to a 100-year period of time where this is not taken for granted within evangelical circles. In fact, there are people who are indifferent to church members, lots of people who are indifferent to church membership, and then a certain percentage who are actively opposed to the idea of church membership, either because they don't see it explicitly in Scripture, as Jonathan said, or because there's been a lot of publicity, and there always is, about difficulties, challenges, leadership failures, that and abuse and all kinds of other things that church membership is seen as a kind of, you're making yourself a hostage to fortune because all these bad things could happen. So it's interesting that a book like this needs to be written, but it really does.
I think especially currently in Western culture, we've become so consumeristic. And the idea is that I'll eat at that restaurant until I find a better one, or until I get fired, until I get tired of the fare. And then I'll move on. And so there's a kind of consumeristic approach that just doesn't want to commit itself beyond, the meal in front of you on any given day. Whereas church membership is actually saying that I'm devoted for the long haul. I'm placing myself under authority. This isn't even a club where everybody is exactly in peer membership necessarily. It's something you join in which you are placed under leaders and to whom you owe some, you have some obligation. So I think that there's this about me, Jonathan. I think you once told me that I'm not a joiner, and you were right about that. But this is the one thing which I've always felt I must be joined in membership to the local church. This is that one thing where membership is a must and membership matters. I think people are members of all sorts of things right now, but that membership has such low level obligation that it's just easy to transfer that mentality over into the church as well.
It also comes down to our own understanding of our propensity to sin, because it occurred to me, particularly as Jonathan was outlining some of the benefits, the blessings of church membership, some of them are particularly needed when we go off track. And if you really believe what we often sing in the hymn, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love, to the extent that you believe that's actually true about yourself, it's very wise for you to say, because I have the propensity to not see things clearly, because I am apt to sin, because I can get led astray into false teaching, I actually need people whose charge and obligation and duty and is to have oversight over my soul. And so it has often struck me that this lack of willingness to submit oneself to church membership has a lot to do with the fact that you're assuming that you will never be the problem. And I think actually Scripture and our own experience with our hearts should teach us, no, it's possible that there could come a time when I will need corrective, at least discipline in some fashion, where someone will need to take me aside and I'll have to listen to them. And that ultimately is for the good of my soul.
Yeah, this is, I think the discipline of the church, which is not just to excommunicate, but also to rehabilitate those that are caught in a trespass. There needs to be some level of formalized commitment on the part of the sheep to those under shepherds, so that those under shepherds themselves can know clearly to whom exactly they have their obligation as shepherds. And if the sheep don't identify themselves as sheep of this particular local church, then it really puts the shepherds who have to give an account for their souls into a really difficult place, in as much as they don't know whose souls exactly they're obliged for. So I think these are other considerations that should enter into thoughts on church membership.
Well, the book is entitled Church Membership. It's in the Blessings of the Faith series. The author is Jonathan Landry Cruse. And we have a couple copies that we can give away to those who enter their contact information at theologyonthego.org or placefortruth.org. There's a spot there for you to do that. If you know someone who would be helped either by this episode or by this podcast, please pass it along to them. And if you can rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you download or stream it, that's a huge help to us as well in getting the word out. And finally, if you are able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. There's a donate button on the top right-hand corner of both of those screens. As always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.